This past March, during their spring break, the youth initiates, 5 of the mentors, and the group's co-leaders, Pam, Hyde, and I, took a trip down to the border region near Tucson, Arizona. You, the members of the United Church Santa Fe, commissioned us to take this service learning trip in order that we might learn more and inform ourselves firsthand about the complex and sometimes contentious issues that surround immigration and border policy today. We carried with us our clear and constant mandate, a Christian mandate, to care for all of God's creation and to serve those in need, especially the most vulnerable, in whatever ways we would be able to do. Our trip offered us an opportunity to study and witness courtroom proceedings of the Operation Streamline program. We learned about environmental effects of border policy and the border wall that exists between Mexico and the United States, and we walked the migrant trails, those used by many who are coming north seeking safety and a more dignified existence. Each night, we met for fellowship and for reflection. One evening, we met and used a scripture verse from Matthew, the Beatitudes, as a guide for our conversation. We read, "Blessed are the meek, and blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the poor in spirit." We used this teaching as a guide for our conversation. We asked ourselves, where today did we see someone who hungered or thirsted for righteousness? Where today did we see a peacemaker? As you know, these 6 initiates are extraordinary. They're compassionate, they're intelligent. They grappled with these questions and responded with such profound insight that their mentors and Pam and I were taken aback. We've asked them to share some of those reflections with you today, and I hope that you'll learn from them more about the border region and what they bring, and just about who the initiates are. We're going to begin with Jesus' teachings from the Mount of Olives, the Beatitudes, and then we'll listen to how the youth initiates considered and responded to these teachings through the lens of their experience of the time they spent at the U.S. border. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. There he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are those who know their need of God, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the clear in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Word of God, word of life.
I found that my experience in southern Arizona gave me an insight into how our immigration system works and how it is very ineffective. The one part of our glimpse of this process that struck me the most was Operation Streamline. If someone had been apprehended crossing the border for the second time, they were sent through this process. The first time someone crosses the border, the crime goes on their record as a misdemeanor with so much time in a private, for-profit detention center, nothing less than a jail. The sentence the judge imposes seemed done at random, anywhere from 30 to 160 days. Observing this in a courtroom made me feel that these people were being treated less than any American would be. The process does not have individual trials, but is more like an assembly line. 7 of the apprehended people stand at the front of the courtroom and are each asked the same set of questions, then given a sentence and are walked off in their shackles to go to their detention center. We watched about 45 people do this from many different countries in Central America. I observed 2 types of people. Those few who were strong and confident, seeming to believe that they were being persecuted for righteousness' sake, and the majority who had no idea what was going on, who recognized their need of God, following the answers of those before them. Many of the people had been fleeing death threats, knowing no English, possibly little Spanish, stuck in this fancy, intimidating building with only 7 minutes with a lawyer who could very well not care about preparing them. I can hardly imagine how that might feel. One man in particular, who looked very young, may have been lucky, but he probably didn't realize it. He was illiterate and spoke very little Spanish, but his lawyer recognized that and asked for more time for them to prepare. I admire the amount of generosity this lawyer had, agreeing to reschedule his trial on the only available day during her daughter's spring break. She was a peacemaker, pure in heart. I saw God in both the man and his lawyer. One can only hope the best for them.
On my trip to Arizona, I saw many things maybe I didn't want to see, and others that made me proud or that made me angry. They did make me see on a different perspective that I had never witnessed, and they made me see things that maybe other people don't get to see very often in their lifetimes. I saw things that I'd never seen, and others that made me wonder, how could they make that decision, or how could they make that choice? All the experiences I had and all the memories that I made on the border immersion trip will be in my heart and my mind as long as I can keep them. One thing I saw, which made me proud, was that somebody during Operation Streamline was hungering for righteousness' sake. It was the judge, and he was an amazing judge. He wasn't just doing it because he was told to, he was also taking it to heart, considering it, contemplating what was going on with the immigrants standing before him. He was, as I was told by Mike, a very nice and kind judge, making sure the immigrant understood what he was agreeing to, and that he wasn't just repeating what was said by the person before him. He took time out of his free time to get him a fair trial he could understand. He took the trial on another day, even though he may not have wanted to. I thought that it was very noble of him and nice of him to do that, especially since he was the judge, and especially that it was just so one person could get a fair trial. He was hungering for righteousness' sake. Another thing, in a way, was on our hikes on the immigrant trails, something was showing the need of God in the immigrants' lives. I don't know whether or not the immigrants believe in God, but some people recognize that they needed God, somebody to turn to when there's no one else left to turn to, someone you can talk to, who will always listen and give you what's best. Whether that is hope or love, God will give it to you. Some immigrants showed their need and other people's need for God by hanging up rosaries on trees outside the immigrant trails. This gives people hope and tells them that God is always with them, no matter what, and that when they need someone, God, in their lives, he will be there always. It made me less worried on our hike, knowing that we had God with us everywhere we went. Those were all things I experienced on my hike and other experiences on my trip, and that I may not be the best writer or describer, but I can do my best. I had other experiences, too, that were similar in some ways. I hope that you were able to understand my descriptions of how I felt during some moments during the border immersion trip.
I saw those who were meek, hungering for righteousness, and poor in spirit, when I saw those backpacks and water bottles in the desert. Their lives were falling apart, just like the backpacks they had abandoned. It isn't fair that these people travel hundreds of miles through the desert in an attempt to get to a better life, only to be shipped back to the country they fled. People are murdered every day because of deportation. They fled things like gangs, rape, and homicide. And because we brought them back to their country of origin, they're going to be killed. Let me give you an example. A man in Honduras flees a gang and travels north to the U.S. When he gets there, he's deported. Once again back in Honduras, he is confronted by the gang, which wants revenge and kills him. The decaying and degrading backpacks that I saw are a symbolic and spiritual reminder of how these people sacrifice their lives, either literally or for jail time, in the hopes that they could be one of the lucky few to be admitted into this country. I saw children's shoes and backpacks, bleached, peeling water bottles, and tuna and sardine cans rusted by the sun. It was a reminder that we are fortunate and things could be so much worse for us. At one of the water stops, there was a rosary, green, white, and blue, with a white stone cross in the center. It was a symbol of hope in desolate times and places. In the middle of nowhere, 40 miles and an hour and a half from Tucson, where life-giving water sat on a rough, rocky, not easily traversed path, a symbol of hope and perseverance sat proudly on a waxy plant. This was a symbol of how even in the worst of times and places, you find the face of God. In every one of the convicted migrants' faces, I saw the face of God. In my opinion, the immigration system is horribly disfigured, and we are all suffering because of a dysfunctional system.
During the immersion trip, I saw many happy things and sad things. I saw people being persecuted for no reason. When we were out on the immigrant trails, I saw shoes left by people who have been traveling hundreds of miles. But on this trip, I didn't see in person an immigrant who was hungering for righteousness. But I saw their discarded and lost items, which made me imagine their desperation. It was hot outside, and you couldn't go 30 feet without seeing a backpack or piece of clothing. There were hundreds of empty bottles and food packaging left on the ground from all the immigrants going through the trail. But what really broke my heart was the rosaries left hanging on trees. Still, our group was out there as peacemakers. We left water on the ground for the immigrants, which to an immigrant must have been the best thing ever, especially after they've been walking so long. On the trail, imagine being an immigrant seeing all of those backpacks, shoes, and pieces of clothing. That must have been so discouraging for the immigrants who were traveling. But I bet when they saw a gallon tank of water, I bet that was amazing. The heat in some parts of the day is terrible, although when we went, it was cool and not super hot. But we also went in the winter, so in the summer, it is almost up to 105 degrees, and sometimes even 110 degrees. So after all of that, the immigrants were probably thinking about how they could have or still could just go back to Mexico and not even risk getting caught. I'm sure some did and just wanted to go back to their family and friends they left. But others knew they were going to something better, whether they were going from gang violence or just needed a new start. Or maybe after the gang violence in their own city, they were hopeful and wanted to get to Tucson, which was 40 miles away. When you come from something like gang violence and stuff like that, it is very hard to change your mind and go back to where you're from. So in conclusion, the trip was an emotional ride. It was also a very meaningful and spiritual journey to me, because when I grow up, I want to stick up for the immigrants. It was a spiritual journey at some points because it made me seem closer to God, like when we were having fun as a group at an amusement park. And on the hike, it made me seem closer to God because all of those people are praying just to live, so I think God is closer to those trails than anywhere else.
I would like to introduce Debbie and Ed, leaders of the Samaritans group, who hungered for righteousness while they led us through a popular immigrant trail, where we placed jugs of water and collected immigrants' backpacks. We stood in a circle in front of an 8-foot-tall shed, filled with jugs of water, and on its gray door was a picture of a tan child, lying in a pile of leaves with scarlet blood splatter on his cheek, and underneath it read, "The child's name would not have survived if not for us." This was the Samaritan shed. Debbie and Ed work placing water on popular immigrant trails, as well as search for immigrants who they bandage or give socks and snack bags. Eventually, when Ed and his wife were telling us about the immigrant trails, Ed's wife pulled out a slashed plastic jug and claimed that a Border Patrol officer had slashed it. Immigrants have a hard time getting their water. If it's placed up too high in a tree, a helicopter's searchlight might glance over it, finding an immigrant. Often animals' bites make holes in the lids of water jugs. Other times, the lids are popped off by animals, even if the water was hidden in the shade. Immigrants travel through the night in the desert of Arizona, as thorns rip through their skin and plants smack at their faces. Even after Ed mapped 3,000 miles of trails, I felt selfish that we couldn't guarantee immigrants what they needed to survive. Eventually, we would leave, back to the air-conditioned van, with guaranteed United States citizenship.
We went to the border to Arizona to learn, to support immigrants and those helping them, and to take some opportunities to see God. I was impressed and amazed, as you probably have been, with these youth and in their mentors and leaders. I saw God in our youth, and in the words of one of our mentors, Ed Barker, in their responsibility, their responsiveness, their behavior, and their thoughtfulness. I saw God when, after a very early start and a very long 8-hour road trip in a van, these young people were still attentive and engaged while watching courtroom proceedings affecting the lives of undocumented immigrants being sentenced in assembly line fashion. These young people listened with interest one morning to an informative and sophisticated presentation about the border and the current and proposed walls, and they were still attentive and asking good questions after lunch at a presentation about children and youth crossing the border. I saw God in the emotions on their faces when they first saw the actual border and part of the current wall, recognizing the message of exclusion it sends to those on both sides, and as they have described their emotion and heartfelt concern when they saw backpacks, water bottles, and articles of clothing left in the desert, recognizing what those items mean for those trying to cross that desert. I saw God in these youths' responses to the reflection questions each evening and their ability to engage in the same manner and with the same depth of understanding as their adult mentors and leaders. I also saw God in the nature that we saw and the young people's reactions to our time at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum, especially the raptors and what we learned from their ways of living, hunting, surviving, and being in community with others like themselves and also with humans so different from them. I saw God in these young people's willingness to help and take care of each other, to help the whole group when asked and even sometimes before being asked, and to follow the inevitable rules that are necessary when a large group like this travels together. I also saw God in their joy at being finally freed up to jump in the swimming pool in the afternoon and dig in and make an ice cream sundae after dinner and crash into bed after a long day of learning and fun and fellowship. Their laughter at lunches and dinners and while participating in games and rides at the amusement park we went to with us as adults and with each other filled my heart with joy as well. You've heard today about what they learned and experienced and its impact on them. You commissioned them, and they served and represented you well. These young people are the future. They're our future as a country and as a church, and you can expect great things from them, and you can be very proud. You're going to hear one more reflection from our final youth initiate. Jose.
On the trip to the border of Mexico, I witnessed someone mourning. I witnessed this person while in Operation Streamline. Operation Streamline, as Madeline described, is a plea bargain trial which sends immigrants to private, for-profit detention centers. The immigrants have a lawyer who stands next to them as they plead guilty. They leave the room, and then the next 40 immigrants come in. I witnessed mourning in all of the immigrants. Perhaps this is because many of the immigrants felt they were being punished for seeking a safer and better life. One of the immigrants from Guatemala was really sad about his situation. I could see how sad he was when he was pleading guilty to the judge. When he left the rooms in handcuffs, he hugged his lawyer and then walked with his head down out of the courtroom. The other person who was mourning was me. I was mourning because it was so sad what would happen to them. Sitting in the courtroom made me think I could have been one of them. I am a native Mayan, and if something made me flee from my home country, which is Guatemala, I might have been one of them. It also made me think of my mom, and if she could have been one of them in the room. If my mom told me to go across the border without her, I would refuse. This is because I would not leave her behind, and Operation Streamline would be hard. I was quiet for most of the day, reflecting on if I was one of them in the courtroom. In the courtroom, I felt the presence of God, and many of the times when I mourn, I feel the presence of God. In the courtroom, the presence of God was really strong. After the Operation Streamline, I think to myself, why was God's presence stronger in the courtroom than any of my other times in my life? If I was one of them and I didn't know English, it would be hard for me, just like many of them in the courtroom. Going to the border for me is still hard, This is mainly because when I go to the border, it reminds me of my mother. If many of you don't know me, I'm an adopted native Mayan from Guatemala. I've been on 2 border trips. I would have been on 3 trips, but it was too hard for me. Thinking of my mom is hard for me. I'm not really accustomed to talking about my mom. I still think of her, but I feel blessed to have been adopted by my 2 lovely parents, Jack and Kim. God showed me someone who's mourning on the border trip, and I realized that I mourned with them. I am glad that God showed me that way, and I am so glad that I've gone on the border trip. Thanks be to God.